Hi folks, welcome back. We're going to continue down essentially the theoretical selections that the book lays out for us, and that brings us into Chapter 9, Section 9, which is dealing with one of my favorites, and that is Marxist and conflict theories. Uh, Marx had many things wrong, but Marx had many things right as well. And his understandings of power, conflict, and deviance in relationship to power structure are certainly insightful. So let's get going. Um, Marxist and conflict theories are similar. They're both social construction theories or relativist perspectives. Um, but their definitions of power differ. Uh, Essentially, Marx is looking at political economy, and conflict theorists are expanding beyond Marx, taking his conflict theory and bringing it into race and gender and um, other forms of inequality. Um, these are both macro levels theories. They're looking at structural issues, institutions, and they're more focused on group versus individual experiences. As I mentioned earlier, Marx is looking at political economy. It's the economy that creates the inequality, the bourgeoisie, which is the elite, versus the proletariat, which is the poor and the poor or working class folks. Um, and Marx focuses on the capitalist system. And if you really want to understand power and conflict and deviance, all you need to look at is the system inequality or the systemic inequality that's embedded in the capitalist form. And conflict theory broadens that, as I mentioned earlier, into the idea that power is more complex than having a singular focus on the capitalist system. They're not necessarily suggesting revolutionary overthrow of a capitalist system. They're really more committed to reforming rather than revolutionizing the social order. Some essentially are some essential assumptions of the Marxist conflict theorist. One, conflict exists, especially in a capitalist form of social order. Conflict arises from power differentials in society, whether that's based on political economy or gender, race, ethnicity, and then laws are administered uh, to some and not others. So laws usually benefit those in power and usually are at the detriment of those that are disadvantaged. Some questions that we really need to think about when we're talking about conflict theory and Marxist theory is, why are certain groups more likely to be considered deviant? And why are some actions which many might consider harmful not considered deviant or criminal? And this ties all back into power differentials in society. Uh, why is crack cocaine seen as a greater offense, possession of cocaine seen as a greater offense than a possession of powder cocaine? Well, it's because black folks usually are caught with crack cocaine, whereas white folks are usually caught with powder cocaine. Marxist theory, of course, is based on the ideas of Karl Marx. Marx's works were influenced or have influenced communication studies, economics, political science, criminology, sociology. He is a far-reaching theoretical perspective. Marxism, conflict theory, it's been around a long time, and the reason it's still around today and being talked about today is because it's relevant. He's looking at the capitalist system and how it creates conflict inequality and power differentials. Marx is concerned with the ruling class and how it keeps the workforce divided, thus more easily controlled. Whenever I think about Marx and I think about the social order, I see the ruling class, which is a smaller group of people. Now, I was a Marine at one time in my life, and when you thought about fighting a larger force and you're a smaller force, one of the things that you want to do is break that force down into manageable numbers, divide and conquer. And if you can do that, a smaller force has a lot better chance at controlling and dominating a larger body. Marx, of course, argues that the fundamental basis of society is class conflict and struggle, and that class conflict and struggle is between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he ends up with this Communist Manifesto that essentially ends with the call for the workers of the world to unite. An important theorist that continued to use Marxist theory is Turk. Turk argues capitalist conflict is diversionary. It's designed to keep workers focused on issues promoting division, competition, and othering. One of the examples in the book talks about the LGBTQ community and how that conflict can help continue the divisions between individuals that may come together and work together to create a better workforce or a more representative workforce or a workforce that pays a higher wage. But if you create all these divisions and you create all these others, then the workforce is less likely to activate itself against the bourgeoisie. Marx believed in that conflict existed. It was a part of the social order. And he was concerned with social relationships of the owners of the means of production, as I mentioned earlier, the bourgeoisie, and the laborers, or the proletariat. He talks about how owners maximize their profits by minimizing labor costs. But according to Marx, this is where the things start to break down. Laborers are the ones that create the products that are ultimately sold. And he believed that laborers should earn the full price of the product. But in a capitalist system, those laborers are exploited and do not gain hardly anything from the fruits of their labor. So the bourgeoisie ultimately has control over the means of production and communication. Thus, there's little that the proletariat has in an effort to stand up, and they're ultimately forced to succumb. It's not seen as a socially acceptable thing by the ruling elite for workers to walk out on strike. Unions are frowned upon in our society today, where at other times in our society, unions have been much more influential. And when they are, workers tend to have better rights. And but that isn't where we are today. I'm not saying that unions aren't in existence, but they are much less influential than they have been in the past. Outside of some very visible unions like the Major League Baseball Association union, the players union, that's a really strong union. Those guys get paid a lot of money to play baseball, and their unions, based on collective bargaining, have guaranteed that they will receive part of the profits from what they actually produce. That is the game that everybody watches. Another Marxian idea is dialectical materialism. He's arguing that reality exists in the material world, meaning that reality is separate from the meaning that individuals give it. So that tree, even though it might not be, it might not see itself as a tree, it still exists even if people aren't thinking about it. And so Marx, he believes there's this dialectical relationship, a dialectical negotiation of contradictions that we find in the natural world. And he believes that society is full of contradictions, and negotiating these contradictions ultimately creates a new material world. And um, and so we see the movement between the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis of an idea. And so if, for example, you're thinking about prohibition, and there's a group that believes that the thesis maybe is that alcohol should be prohibited, and that's the thesis that is carried on by those that support prohibition. And then the antithesis could come from the liquor industry that believes that there should be no regulations on the consumption of alcohol. And then you have a synthesis, which could be um, reasonable, responsible laws that govern the use of alcohol. So you can't drive a vehicle if you've been drinking, or you can't drink until you're 21. That's a compromise. And then all of a sudden we have a new thesis, which is you can't drink and drive, and you can't drink until you're the age of 21. Marxism believed that the law was used by the elite to guarantee their interests. The state in and of itself, which is the possessor of the use of force, the legitimate use of force, whether that is through the enforcement of laws or the use of military or police to expel an intruder or something like that, it's still the state that does that. And the state is in place to protect capitalism and ultimately the elite that benefit from that system. Even though Marx understood things about how the law worked in the system, he really wasn't, there was no specific definition of the law. He more discussed how law was used to maintain the status quo or the bourgeoisie, the power structure of the status quo or the bourgeoisie. For Marx, law is the instrument used to maintain capitalism. It takes a real social force, a social movement, to push back against a set of laws that are designed to protect the capitalists. We saw this happen in the late 1960s with the environmental movement. And all of a sudden, the state created laws that were designed to prevent the business class, the capitalist class, from being able to continue to reap its benefit from polluting the environment. He talks about how law forces us to look at what's on paper versus what's actually happening in the real world. So equality on paper means that we can ignore inequality in practice. So laws benefit people, but they generally benefit the ruling class. What he's saying here is that just because there's a law on the books and it gives the perception that law is administered in an equal fashion, we know that the more money you have, the better defense you will have in reference to the law. And those with a lot of money tend to get away with things that those with little money cannot. And that is inequality represented in the law in favor of the ruling class at the expense of the working class.